Good morning. My name is Chuck Smith, and you can turn those cards into me that Floyd was talking about. I grew up in West Virginia, fully engaged in the process of democracy. My mother was an election poll worker and was involved in the civil rights movement during the 1960s. I was involved in student government and even got elected governor at the American Legion Boys State Camp during my high school years. I was also vocal critic of injustices in my community and larger society. All of the winners and MVPs in the statewide youth program sponsored by the American Legion and in their civic and sports programs got to speak at the American Legion State Convention. The other people took their time to thank the group for sponsoring their respective programs in sports and for providing them with opportunities to participate. Not me. I took this opportunity to take the American Legion to task for their treatment of Black veterans and women. I used a passage from the book of Revelations that essentially said that God expects you to be like hot or cold water, and if you're lukewarm, you'll be spit out immediately. I told them that I was encouraged that there were no longer a Black American Legion and a white American Legion, although the local chapters were still quite segregated. I expressed my disappointment that women could only attain auxiliary status within the American Legion, a bit lukewarm in my estimation. What could go wrong with sharing the word of God with a group of God-fearing veterans? I received their polite applause from the group and a couple of comments from Black Legionnaires that the integration of the group looked better on paper than it did in practice. The customary follow-up invitations to speak at local Legion chapters did not come. God may not like lukewarm, but the American Legion did not like hot. W.E.B. Du Bois introduced the concept of double consciousness in his 1903 book, The Souls of Black Folk. Essentially, African Americans experience the tension of being forced to view themselves through the devaluing lens of white society, and also work to see their true, authentic self. Now, I was not formally introduced to the concept of double consciousness when I was younger, although my family did debate historical figures at the kitchen table. I wasn't following very closely and didn't have the book to read along with it. But I was certainly aware that the larger white society viewed me differently than I saw myself. I was content that my mother and father were impressed with my speech at the American Legion, and I didn't have any strong reaction to not being invited to places that I was never welcomed before. So, fast forward in my life, and the many experiences and lessons that led to me consider, how do I fit into systems that in spaces that did not have people like me in mind when they were created? I was even on the path of becoming an Air Force officer and defending the Constitution and our democracy. Democracy in America was not designed with any intention to have people like me involved. One of the benefits of experiencing double consciousness is called second sight, the ability to critically look at and understand the nuances of social dynamics. So, I'm not surprised, appalled, or distressed about the state of democracy when it was not conceived in a way to include me. I am, however, concerned. I must live with whatever we do and become as a country. Democracy in America has been slowly heating up and cooling off for 250 years to include people like me and others who were excluded from the beginning. For me, it still tastes lukewarm.
Our reading today is from Rosemerry Wahtola Trommer, who writes, "Learning from the Highwire Walkers." First, they start close to the floor. Practice walking heel to toe. Practice bouncing and turning and gazing at a distant object instead of looking down at their feet. As the stakes and the rope get higher, they begin to practice failure. Practice hanging from the wire for long periods of time. Practice holding their own weight. Perhaps this is what we are doing now with democracy. Practicing how to hold up our weight. Don't look down. View it all as practice. Trust that balance depends on tension. Trust that every step matters. Yesterday marked 250 years of the democratic republic that is the United States of America. It is not a failed experiment. But for many of us, it feels like an experiment that is in a certain amount of trouble. In some ways, it's hard for us to truly realize what a novel experiment our Declaration of Independence was in 1776. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. As Heather Cox Richardson wrote in her Letters from an American column on July 3rd, for all the fact that the congressman got around the sticky little problem of Black and Indigenous enslavement by defining men as white men, and for all that it never crossed their minds that women might also have rights, the Declaration of Independence was actually an astonishingly radical document. In a world that had been dominated by a small class of rich men for so long that most people simply accepted that they should be forever tied to their status at birth, a group of upstart legislators on the edges of a continent declared that no man was born better than any other. America was founded on the radical idea that all men are created equal. In the early 1700s, people didn't think that they were created equal. There were kings, and there were serfs, and there was a merchant class in there somewhere. But you basically were born into a social class, and that's where you stayed. The notion that all men were created equal was tested in the 1850s, when white Southerners tried to codify a lesser position for African Americans and indigenous people, as well as less favored immigrants, people from China and Mexico and even Ireland. They lost the Civil War, but as Chuck pointed out in his reflection, equality took much, much longer and is again in danger. I am frightened that our Supreme Court is moving back toward an originalist view of the Constitution because we're not an originalist country. Automatic rifles are not the same as muskets. The vast majority of us believe that women are now included in people who were created equal. A perversion of justice now holds that the Voting Rights Act works so well that Black Americans no longer need protection in voting, and so gerrymandering voting districts to protect Republicans is perfectly legal and has nothing to do with race. And our president, while barely losing his efforts to quash birthright citizenship, is being allowed to strip protections from Haitian and Somali refugees while putting white South Africans at the front of the immigration line. There are a shocking number of ways that our president is moving us away from democracy and towards fascism. Fascism, as we have discussed before, is less an ideal than a series of tactics. According to scholars Timothy Snyder and separately Lawrence Britt, who wrote this in 2003, so it's not related to any one person. Signs of fascism include a disdain for the truth, a place where lies are just alternative truths, a sense of a glorious nation of the past that we must return to, strict gender roles where men are protectors and women are helpmates and mothers, and those who don't fall into gender binaries are dangerous and after the rest of us. Identification of enemies and a dehumanization of others, especially immigrants. An obsession with national security and a lack of controls on police or military behavior. A shutting down of dissent through suing news outlets, stopping grant money to universities for research, reducing public news outlets, and brutal suppression of protests. Rampant cronyism and corruption. We are seeing so many of these things now. A president who earned $2.2 billion in his first 18 months back in office by demanding financial fealty from wealthy individuals, and by rampant corruption in cryptocurrency where he makes money and his small investors lose it. I believe most of us recognize many of these signs, so I'm not going to go into many of them, but I will highlight a couple of them that I think may be less familiar to some of us. Number 3 on Lawrence Britt's list is identification of enemies using scapegoats as a unifying cause. He writes, the people are rallied into a unifying patriotic frenzy over the need to eliminate a perceived common threat or foe. Racial, ethnic, or religious minorities, liberals, communists, socialists, terrorists, etc. Jesse Jayhawk drew my attention to the Prairieland case, one that I had not heard enough about in the constant news cycle. On July 4th, 2025, a group of people protested outside the Prairieland ICE detention center in Texas. The plan, it being July 4th, was to light firecrackers so the detainees inside would see them and know that there were people on the outside who knew they were there and were supporting them, letting them know that they had not been forgotten. I did something similar in, what year was Justice GA in Phoenix? Do you remember?
2012.
Thank you, 2012. 2012, Amy and I went to Justice GA in Phoenix, and we went and sang outside of Sheriff Joe Arpalia's tent city jails. Like many protests I've been to, especially under this administration, protesters use the Signal app to communicate with one another. Police have been known to open protesters' phones and obtain information illegally. So many protesters choose to turn off location signaling and to turn off biometrics that will open phones without a password. I've done that while heading to a No Kings rally. Besides immigrants, one of the most vilified groups by the president is Antifa, anti-fascists. You know, like all of the veterans in World War II who were fighting fascism. The president calls them domestic terrorists and lumps peaceful protesters who call out fascist behavior in with this idea that he has of a group. On July 4th, 2025, a police officer drew his gun and was shooting or going to shoot at a protester who was running away. Benjamin Song, a Marine veteran who was carrying a handgun, shot at the policeman to protect the protester. As he explained it afterwards when he was allowed to, it was a spur-of-the-moment decision to protect an innocent person from being killed, like Renee Good or Alex Preddy, who were killed months after this protest. The officer was not killed or seriously injured, though he was grazed by the bullet. What makes this story especially notable is a couple of things. First, the number of people who were charged with conspiracy to commit domestic terrorism, when no evidence was shown that they intended to participate in a riot or a violent action. One person was charged who later moved a box of zines at the request of his wife. The second notable thing is the incredible length of the sentences. Benjamin Song, who was not allowed to give a reason in court that he shot the officer. He was not allowed to say self-defense. He was not allowed to say that he was coming to the defense of another person. He was sentenced to 100 years in jail. Savannah Batten, whose lawyers noted in a follow-up suit asking that her charges be dismissed because no evidence was shown that she participated in any acts of vandalism, that she coordinated with anyone ahead of time, or had any intention of committing any violent acts, was sentenced to 50 years in prison for riding in the back seat of Song's car on the way to this peaceful protest and waving a sparkler, which they called an explosive device. I give my 6-year-olds explosive devices all the time. Compare this to the longest sentence imposed on a January 6th defendant, Enrique Tarrio, the leader of the Proud Boys, who was charged with seditious conspiracy for organizing the attack from afar and urging his men to not let Biden be installed as president. He received 22 years, which was pardoned by the president along with every other January 6th participant, even those who injured, sometimes fatally, police officers. Daniel Estrada, a Prairieland defendant who moved a box of papers after the protest, which he did not attend, was sentenced to 30 years in prison for conspiracy. It is dangerous to charge peaceful protesters with conspiracy charges. It is an important law to have on the books. People do plan to murder political figures of both parties and are often caught by intelligence agencies, and it is important that there can be charges in those cases even without a death or an injury. However, the sheer enormity of these sentences on little to no evidence is horrific and is designed solely to deter peaceful protest. And that is a hallmark of fascism. The second thing that I want to call out is the dangerous way in which our nation is falling short of our original ideals of democracy. A world where all men are created equal, all humans are created equal, and endowed with certain inalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Our current system of campaign finance, complicated by the recent Supreme Court ruling that money donated is free speech and has no constraints, is creating a world where the rich have not only more money, but far more power. Lobbyists have been a thing for centuries. Members of both parties have given special interests favors based on campaign contributions. However, this administration has blatantly used grift and corruption in unprecedented ways. As reported by the Contrarians, the Department of Justice dropped charges against Indian billionaire Gautam Adani who was indicted in 2024 for an alleged $265 million scheme to bribe officials and defraud American investors. But after Adani hired one of Trump's personal lawyers, Robert J. Gieffra Jr., who said, "Drop the charges and Adani invests $10 billion in the US economy," they dropped the charges. Unlike many presidents who've pardoned low-level drug users or battered women who fought back against their abusers, Trump has mostly pardoned loyalists and folks who've donated large amounts of money, a baseline average of $1 million. He's pardoned billionaire crypto financiers and white-collar criminals who defrauded insurance companies and investors. He's pardoned the former president of Honduras in an effort to influence the election there, who was found guilty of conspiracy to smuggle over 400 tons of cocaine into the United States. And at the same time, this administration has ordered the killing of over 150 people on over 50 small boats thought to be running drugs somewhere in Central America. I fear that we are returning to becoming a nation that believes that some people, rich and white in particular, are more valuable than others. That is not how we were founded, and it's not how we should be. Democracy is not a perfect system, whether by republic and elected representatives or not. As a person whose marriage has been voted on more times than I care to count, I know that majority rules isn't always the best way to go. But I do know and believe that all human beings are created equal. That equal rights are not special rights, that no one should be treated as less than human based on their race or country of origin or creed or gender or orientation or their beliefs. I also believe that actions should and can be limited. You may have the right to own guns. I believe you don't have the right to carry them into schools. You may have the right to freely practice your religion, but not impose it on others. David Haas writes of obligations and how obligations should matter as much as rights, because rights tend to conflict with each other. I don't believe everything he says, but I do believe that civility and compromise and being informed are important obligations that we have to one another. Two of my favorite of his statements are be civil. He writes, "We all need to remain civil. Civility makes agreement possible even where there are differences and preserves the possibility of working together constructively on these issues down the road, even if we cannot find common ground on the matter at hand. Abusive language, ad hominem attacks, shouting, these and similar behaviors rarely win people over. Yes, civility is close to good manners and politeness, but it is also smart politics, because even when it doesn't win over political opponents, it can win over observers unsure of where they stand." Bless you. And respect norms. Norms, the unwritten traditions, rules, customs, conventions, codes of conduct, and practices should be valued. We should respect them even if we don't have to. Norms provide a necessary supplement to laws and make it possible for a political system to succeed despite inevitable differences. The most basic norm in a democracy is to accept election outcomes and embrace the peaceful transfer of power. One can also think of norms that preclude those with access to inside information from trading on it for personal financial gain. I would also add that an important norm is that at all times our government needs to be the government for all. Storms, wildfires, school shootings, your response needs to not hinge on whether the victims voted for you. We are all one nation. I think this is the largest norm that is being completely ignored these days, and it scares me. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, we are all wrapped up in a single garment of destiny. We are a better nation when all of our residents have access to health care, to homes and food, and a basic quality of life. Heather Cox Richardson ended her column yesterday by saying, "But just as in the 1850s, we are now once again facing a rebellion against our founding principle as a few people seek to reshape America into a nation in which certain people are better than others." The men who endorsed the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776, pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to defend the idea of human equality. Ever since then, Americans have sacrificed their own fortunes, honor, and even their lives for that principle. Lincoln reminded Civil War Americans of those sacrifices when he urged the people of his era to, quote, "take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion." That we here highly resolve that these dead should not have died in vain, that this nation under God should have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Words to live by in 2026, she concludes. View it all as practice. Trust that balance depends on tension. Trust that every step matters. May it be so. Blessed be, and amen. As you go from this place, have hope. It's kind of screwed up right now. I know that. It can get better. I know that too. Go in peace and go in love and carry hope in your hearts, my friends. Blessed be, and amen.